Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to those of you who are here nice and early, ready to come in. Welcome to the Norwich Bookstore Online. My name is Sam, and as many of you know, I am one of the new owners, along with my partner Emma, of the Norwich Bookstore in Norwich, Vermont. And whether you're joining us from the Upper Valley here or from far away somewhere else in New England or even somewhere else in the country, I just want to extend a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us tonight. One of the really exciting things about these virtual author appearances is that people can tune in from all over the country and all over the world. So we're grateful to you for joining us from wherever you are. Before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping measures to take care of. First of all, I want to thank you again for your support of local independent bookstores. Tonight, Tom Wessels' new book, hotly anticipated, New England's Roadside Ecology, is going to be available from the Norwich Bookstore, and I'm going to post a link in the chat shortly where you can purchase that book. I'll also post some links to some of Tom's other books that you can purchase, and you can place an order with us via our website. We'll ship your book anywhere in the continental United States or Hawaii and Alaska. Of course, using USPS Media Mail, we also have some other options available to expedite that, and you will be supporting our store, supporting authors, supporting a small press, Timber Press. So thank you so much for your support and for your interest in this book. Now, tonight we're going to talk for a little while. Tom and I are going to talk about the book and about some of the sites in the book. And then we're going to open this up to questions. I know that a lot of you have questions, have done workshops with Tom in the past, and are also avid hikers and roadside ecologists in your own right. So I expect that there will be some lively conversation. Here's how you can post questions. You can drop them into the chat, or you'll see at the bottom of your screen that there's a little Q&A module. And you can also type your question in there, and we will get to as many questions as we have time for. Before the evening is out. Now, once again, the book that we are discussing tonight is New England's Roadside Ecology. It is brand new from Timber Press. It is perhaps probably my favorite cover of the season. It's early yet, but this is just a beautiful little book. And we are so grateful to be here with Tom Wessels tonight. Tom, though he probably needs no introduction to many of you. I'm going to give him one anyway. But he is someone who I know many of you around New England have enjoyed working with and hearing from and attending classes and lectures with and learning from over the years. So we are so excited to be with him this evening. Once again, we're coming to you live from the Norwich Bookstore in Norwich, Vermont, and you can purchase copies of New England's Roadside Ecology and other books by Tom Wessels from the Norwich Bookstore. I will post those links in the chat. And without further ado, I would love to get this show on the road. We are here tonight with Tom Wessels. Tom Wessels is a terrestrial ecologist, and he's professor emeritus at Antioch University New England, where he founded the program for the master's degree in conservation biology. With interests in forests, desert, Arctic, alpine, and more other ecosystems, plus geomorphology, evolutionary ecology, complex system science, and the interface of landscape and culture. Tom, needless to say, considers himself a generalist. And he has been conducting workshops on ecology and sustainability throughout the region and throughout the country for more than 3 decades. We are very grateful to have him with us tonight. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Tom Wessels. Tom, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I wanted to start out by asking you to kind of start at the beginning with the concept of this book. The book is New England's Roadside Ecology. It's a big topic. What first got you interested in going back into the forensics of New England ecology, and what inspired you to dig into the book, into the subject matter of the book in this way?
So it was back in April 2019. Stacy Lawrence, who's the acquisition editor at Timber Press, emailed me just to see if I'd be interested in doing a natural history book with them, because they were starting to expand their natural history offerings and they wanted to move into New England. And in the email, she mentioned the Roadside Geology series. And many states have a roadside geology book that, basically instruct people that if you're driving on this road at this point, there's going to be this really cool rock outcrop and you can get out and look at it. And then they interpret it in the book. And I thought, wow, maybe I could take that idea, but the stop would be at a trailhead roadside parking area that would take people into really cool natural communities here in New England. So that's what sort of sparked the idea. And it was a very fun book to work on because a lot of these sites I already knew about. There were some new ones that I learned about, and just going to them and actually, walking the trail, taking notes, photographing things on the trail. It became a real sort of joyous way to do a book.
Let's talk about some of the sites. You covered the entire region, all the way up to the very northern Maine, all the way through Vermont and New Hampshire and all around. What were your criteria for selecting the sites that you read about in the book?
So there was, basically one. I wanted to get to sites that were open to the public, that had good hardened trail systems so that if we had an increase in visitation, it wouldn't damage the site. And that the trails were not seriously difficult. Most of the trails in the book are 1 to 2 miles in length, and I'd say the majority are pretty easy. Some are really level. I'd say maybe half a dozen of the sites are probably handicap accessible. I know that the Manchester Cedar Swamp site in Manchester, New Hampshire, they're working to make their whole trail system handicap accessible. That can be done sometime this fall. And the places had to have really exemplary natural communities that really sort of displayed really cool things. So for example, in terms of forests, there's a lot of the sites that have, old growth trees in them and old growth, stands. So those are basically the criteria: good hardened trails, public access, trails that were not exceedingly difficult, and really cool things that could be seen on those sites.
Yeah, that really shows throughout the book. And as someone who was familiar with the roadside geology books over the years, this, I think, goes much further. You spend a lot of time, it seems, making sure that these are easily hikeable and easily accessible places, which I really appreciate, and I think a lot of folks will. You talk a little bit at the beginning of the book in the introduction about good trail etiquette, which was not something I was expecting to find in this book, but I was excited to see it there. Could you talk a little bit about your philosophy on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, these sites are really quite exquisite, and I don't want them degraded at all by potential increase in hiker traffic. So I really stress to people that to just stay on the trails, don't venture off the trail on these sites, because if more and more people come in and people do that, they're going to start really having impacts. I also mentioned that a really good way to do this is if people have young children, to teach their children about this. I find that young kids instantly get it. So up here, I'm up right now in Mount Desert Island, Maine, and love hiking up on the exposed granite domes of Acadia National Park. And when I've been up there with children, I say, you can step anywhere on this bedrock, but don't step into any of these like little depressions where their plants are. Don't even step on areas that are just exposed sand, because if no one steps there, the plants will grow back. And the kids get it right away. It's like, I guess, a step in a crack, you break your mother's back. I don't know, but they get it. And then they will sort of hound their parents. I've seen kids say, "Dad, you're standing in, those plants there." And so kids are really good at this, but I do stress it a lot in the beginning because I don't want these sites degraded in any way.
That is one of the things that you mentioned in the introduction, is that some of these sites are going to get more visitor traffic because of the book. So it's important to remember that as we kind of look toward preserving a lot of these sites. You write a lot about some of the kind of gnarled and ancient trees that we find throughout our landscape here. And several species have proved to be really, really resilient, which, sort of something we pride ourselves on here in New England, I'm finding, is resiliency. Some of these trees have survived fires and lightning strikes and hurricanes, et cetera, et cetera. They're growing through boulders. Which tree in New England do you find most resilient and why?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there's two trees that come right to mind as being our oldest old growth trees. So I guess they're quite resilient. And that would be the black gum and the northern white cedar. Black gums, as you get up into the northerly reaches of New England, are pretty much only found on ridgetop swamps that get a lot of wind. And the way they've adapted, because if you're growing on mucky peat, the worst thing to happen to you is to get hit by wind and toppled over. Because once you go down into a swamp like that, you're not going to be around very long at all. So the black gums have developed very brittle, lightweight wood. So when they get hit by wind, they just break off the top of their canopy and then vigorously sprout out new branches from there. So a lot of these black gums that are, getting up to 700 years of age have incredibly deformed canopies where they've been broken off many, many times and keep coming back. Northern white cedar is also a tree that gets to great age. I think the oldest ones in the Northeast have been aged at 1,200 years. I don't know if we have any of that age here in New England, but I'm guessing we get them up to at least 700 years like the black gum. And they're unique because they often have really intense spirals because of their old age and slow growth patterns. And they also tend to root graft with neighboring cedars to a greater degree than any other tree species I've seen. And that could be part of their resiliency, because once those root grafts form, those trees are basically, in a cooperative relationship where they're trading energy and nutrients and even information, which can make them more resilient.
For the uninitiated like myself, can you go into root grafting a little bit? That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so pretty much any trees growing within about 15 feet of each other often will graft their roots underground. In other words, when the root crowns grow into each other, there's nowhere to go. They just sort of fuse. And this is very common in hemlock, even more common in northern white cedar. But it even happens between species. It even happens between hardwoods and conifers. I once saw an example of a hemlock growing next to a yellow birch. Both trees were tipped by wind. Their tip up came up, and you could see clear, really pronounced root grafts between the two trees. And once those form, once again, even between different species, energy, nutrients, moisture going back and forth. And even beyond that, for trees further apart, they're linked up by mycorrhizal fungi, which grow around and into the roots of trees. That's where they get their energy resource from the trees. But any tree that associates with them increases nutrient and water uptake dramatically. And so a lot of our tree species, like our conifers, all of them, our regional conifers, need to interact with mycorrhizal fungi. They can't make it if they don't. So that links everything in a forest together. And again, energy, nutrients, information going back and forth throughout that whole system.
I somehow I had not heard of this in so many years of living around forests. That is fascinating. Something else that you talk about a fair amount in the book is lichen. You clearly have a love for lichen. Could you tell us why it's so important and why it's so important to respect it more than any other plants that we might encounter in the course of a hike? Why is it so important to preserve and protect fungi?
Well, because these lichens, they are fungi, but they're an association of two species of fungus and a species of algae. So they're actually three organisms growing together in one new sort of structural entity. And lichens are critical because if you have exposed bedrock, they're going to be the very first colonizers of that bedrock. So they set the stage for life to start to come back and develop on bedrock situations. And they're cryptobiotic, which means when their moisture levels drop to about 10%, all chemical reactivity stops within them. They can't photosynthesize or respire or do any metabolic activity. And they could be in that state in desert regions for up to a century or more. And then they get exposed to water from rain or fog, and within a minute, they swell up and start photosynthesizing, respiring. So in that cryptobiotic state, they're incredibly brittle. So one step on them and you crush them and they are gone. The other thing for trees, they're important because lichens take in nutrients out of the air. So any tree that can get a good coating of lichen on it gets a nutrient gain, because if you get a heavy rain event, some of that nutrient goes into liquid water soluble form and then just goes down as liquid fertilizer to the tree's roots. So many people think that lichens are harmful to trees, and in fact, they're not. Many trees have developed adaptations to attract them to get the increased nutrients they get from their lichen partners.
Now, a couple of the sites that you mentioned have really acidic conditions, anaerobic acidic conditions. Sacco Heath, I think is how you pronounce that, is one. Orono Bog is another. Can you explain a little bit about the chemistry of these particular sites? They're very unique to New England. They're the kind of sites that we really only see in this region, and what it is that makes them worthy of extra attention.
Well, I think, both of these sites are bogs. So we have a number of different wetlands. We have swamps, which have trees in them. We have marshes, which are dominated by gramineous species like, reeds and sedges and things like that. And then we have bogs, which are dominated here in New England by sphagnum moss and the ericaceous shrub leatherleaf, which stitches all that sphagnum together. So bogs develop on in basically ponds that are very acidic and nutrient deprived. And so you get this sphagnum moss coming in. And as they develop, the pH goes down even further. So a well-developed bog has a pH like around 3.5%. And so all the plants there are basically growing in almost like a desert-like environment. All the shrubs have very tiny leaves because the water's so acidic, they can't take up a lot of it liberally, even though they're in saturated situations. For many of them, it's like growing in a very xeric or dry environment. And we also get a lot of orchids out there. And I should mention, pretty much all of the members of the Heath family, which are our blueberries and huckleberries and leatherleaf and laurels and things like that, as well as all of our orchids have to have mycorrhizal fungi, just like the coniferous trees. So you can get, basically these incredible mycorrhizal communities out there where everything in the bog is interconnected, just like in the forest. So it's quite a special place, and with a lot of unique plants, including, insectivorous plants like pitcher plants that basically eat insects, not for the energy, but for the nutrients in them, as the bog is so nutrient deprived.
A follow-up question on that. You're describing wetlands, essentially, and one of the things that I have heard about New England and this region as it adapts to climate change is that a big challenge we're going to have is going to be water, either too much of it or not enough of it. The fact that it's going to be maybe unpredictable in the future. Do you have a sense of how that challenge will affect areas like this?
Well, it's going to affect everywhere. I mean, certain areas are getting certainly very pronounced effects already. So we're seeing that out in the western states, where they've been in a pronounced drought now for a while, and they're getting these massive fires. But no place is going to be immune from climate change. I think that right now, New England is seemingly a bit more resilient than a lot of other areas. And I have a feeling we're going to start to see a diaspora where people from California, the Southwest, and the Deep South are going to be coming to the North and East, because it's just going to get to be very, very difficult to live in a lot of those places. So there's going to be a lot of challenges that come with that. All of our plant communities are going to have challenges with that. don't want to predict exactly how that's going to play out. I mean, right now, it seems like we are getting more and more precipitation in general, although we have had some pretty dry periods the last few years. Um, but the problem is these rain events come in huge downpours where a lot of it is not absorbed and it runs off, creating a lot of damage. So there's going to be a lot of challenges for plants as well as the human residents of this region, as well as everywhere else.
I have a really interesting question here. At least I thought it was a really interesting question about porcupines. You talk in the book about seeing evidence of what's called browsing by porcupines. How can you spot porcupine hangouts?
Well, their porcupines browse trees, and their favorite tree species is hemlock. So if you have, let's say, a talus slope of boulders where there's denning sites in the boulder caves, and you have hemlock nearby, those hemlock are going to get really deformed. The first thing that happens is often a little shoot gets taken off the top of the tree, and the trunk grows up and then forks. So if you start seeing hemlocks with forked trunks, that means you've got porcupines nearby. But if you have a situation where generations have lived near these hemlocks, the hemlocks get massively deformed. And I remember I was walking into one of these sites with my daughter that I write about in the book when she was 12 years old. And we went to this stand. She goes, "Dad, I think there's an evil arborist that comes in here because the trees were so beat up." I said, "Well, I don't know about evil, but yeah, it might be an arborist. It's called a porcupine."
That's amazing. What is the natural range of porcupines around here? Do we see them here in the Vermont, in the Upper Valley region?
Oh yeah, they're pretty much throughout New England, and they're not uncommon. Again, like I said, if you have a site where there's denning sites near a grove of hemlocks, you're going to see their activity on those trees. And I should mention that studies have shown that porcupines have the highest frequency of bone fractures of any of our regional wildlife, because they're often going out on these, these flexible hemlock branches out to the end to get the most succulent, browse, and often fall off.
Sure. Well, you've got to suffer for your art sometimes. Yeah. So, I mean, as you already know, and as some of you can probably tell from my questions about New England, I am new here, and probably one of the people who will be a prime audience for this book. What should a person like me, I just came from the Seattle area this summer, what should a person like me experience from this book?
Well, I think what you get is a good sense of the variety of ecosystems we have in New England. And, sort of a sense also of the history of these systems. So pretty much in all the forested sites, I'm talking about, whether these areas have always been forested or if they haven't been, if they were once agricultural land, what was their use in the past? Were they crop fields, hay fields, whatever else? And I'm pointing out the evidence of all this stuff on the trail. So basically, I mean, the idea of the book was it's like going on an interpretive walk with me, but I'm not there. But I'm just pointing out what I was noticing when I did the walk in preparation of writing the book.
Can you talk a little bit about how agriculture specifically has affected some of the sites around the region?
Well, in central and southern New England, below, let's say, 2,000 feet in elevation, a bit more than 3/4 of all the land was open for agricultural activity as of the middle 19th century. So it left a very big imprint. Throughout the region, one of the things that we'll see are, extensive, woodland stone walls running off through the woods. Many people think that those were built to mark property boundaries. That's not the case. It's much easier just, to blaze trees or, put up flagging or something to mark a boundary. Those walls were all built to either keep livestock in pastures errata crop fields, and hay fields. So it's estimated that in New England, we have over 250,000 miles of woodland stone walls. That's a lot. That means if we linked it all up, it would wrap the equator 10 times, would stretch past the moon. And I've calculated if you piled all that rock, it would be something like 12 times as massive as all the pyramids in Egypt. And yet it was all built roughly in about a 70-year time frame. So it's really quite a remarkable thing. I guess if we were, on the Mediterranean, New England stone walls would be the eighth wonder of the world, but we're not. It's just an intriguing part of our history.
Actually, great question in the chat. Also on my mind from Kate. So the stone walls a lot of them are pretty short. How did they keep sheep and livestock in or out?
Well, I mean, one thing they did, the stone walls generally went up at least to 3 feet. It's one thing, lifting a rock like this, another having to do that. So they went up to about 3 feet, but then they would use cross poles and a rail above that 3-foot height to get up to maybe about 4 to 4.5 feet. And that was adequate for keeping sheep in those pastures. Now, a lot of the walls today are not as high as they were because, freeze and thaw cycles move the wall and rocks fall off and stuff. But yeah, I'd say on average, they were going up to about waist height, and then the cross poles and rail would get them up to functional height for fencing for livestock.
So I think we'll need to talk about some Upper Valley specific spots here before the night is out. But do you have any favorite sites in the region on the whole around New England? Do you have favorites or special sites?
I do have favorites and special sites. I mean, there's some actually that could have gone into the book, which I didn't put in because either they're just too fragile to really open up to a lot of people, or they're places that I think I would rather keep a little bit quieter. So again, I was going for places near roads that are open to the public with good trail access. So yes, I have a lot of favorite sites. I don't know if I have a favorite site. I like a diversity of things, and there's a lot here in New England that's great to see. And even just going out and sauntering through the woods, just about anywhere, I find that I encounter a lot of cool stuff anyways. But these are sort of the exemplary ones that I chose for the book.
Well, let's talk about the Upper Valley here. I was happy to see that each state has a kind of a little cover page in the book. I was happy to see that the Upper Valley was prominently represented on the Vermont map. How many sites did you from this area did you put into the book? And do you have any that are special to you that you think people should check out?
Well, I mean, in the Upper Valley, I mean, the one you're probably thinking about is the Montshire site, and in Norwich at the Montshire Museum. I chose that one because it is a really interesting historic trail in terms of the different sort of landscape histories that forest has to tell. I mean, it starts right off. You walk into a site that was very much impacted by the hurricane in 1938. And I should mention that was a mammoth storm, probably category 4 to 5, somewhere in that range, that made landfall east of New Haven, Connecticut. And the thing that was very unique about that storm was that it was advancing at a rate of about 40 miles an hour. So it only took about 6 hours for it to travel all the way through New England from, southern coastal Connecticut right up through over the Connecticut River in Massachusetts, over the Green Mountains in Vermont, and then exiting above Lake Champlain into Quebec. So it did that whole trek in about 6 hours. And because of that, it held together as a hurricane for the majority of its way through New England. So I don't know if any other hurricane that's made landfall that has actually maintained hurricane status that far inland. So the Montshire has some good evidence of that, but it also has evidence of pasture and former crop fields that are now wooded, as well as a little pocket of what was old growth forest that was logged probably around 1900. But there's evidence of pine stumps in there of trees that were a good probably 5 feet in diameter, and big old oaks and things like that. So it has a unique sort of historic value, and that's why I included it in the book.
Um, and I actually have a question that I'm not sure if you could shed light on, but I do have a question in the chat about the Montshire trails. Somebody was told recently that you needed to have a day pass for them now. Have you heard anything about that? I hadn't.
Yeah, you do. I mean, I mentioned the start of the chapter that you need to really check in at the front desk and get the pass. Yeah.
Mm.
And I mean, there are some of these sites in the book where there are fees, like, if you want to go up to the Alpine Garden via the Mount Washington Auto Road, well, there's a fee to drive up that. Some of the sites in Western Massachusetts that are trustees of reservation site, if you're not a member of trustees of reservation, I think there's a $5 fee for those sites. So a few of them do have fees, but the vast majority don't.
That's great. And here in the region, if I were taking a day trip from the Upper Valley, from Norwich, Vermont, let's say, I had a couple hours to kill and I wanted to get out of the area. What would be your choice for where to send me that's within a day's drive?
Well, I guess it depends again if you were interested in like forest or alpine or wetland places. That would influence where I direct you. But you can go up into the alpine tundra on Mount Washington, which is probably our best developed tundra ecosystem here in New England. Or you could go into the tallest stand of trees in the Northeast down in Charlemont, Massachusetts. You could get there from where you are in a few hours. So I guess it really depends what you're interested in, because all the sites are pretty cool in their own right.
I love how there are so many different answers to that question. That's definitely illustrated in this book. It's great how accessible everything is and how much thought went into that. That definitely shines through. We had talked a little bit before we started the broadcast about accessibility on trails and how there were some areas in the region, some trail systems where they're working on being more ADA accessible. Could you talk a little bit about what you've learned about that?
Well, I mean, I know that the Nature Conservancy that basically owns the Manchester Cedar Swamp just outside of Manchester, New Hampshire, they're making that all handicap accessible, their whole trail system. And that is a really cool site because they have about 1,000 acres protected there. The trail is in one section of it, so there's a lot of wildland that doesn't have trails in it. And not only that, they're working out a deal with Manchester where they're going to get handicap accessible buses that can bus people from the center of the city out there. So it's going to be a real amazing resource for people that have limited mobility to get out and see some really cool stuff. So I know that they're putting a lot of resources into doing that. And I think that they're scheduled to have that done sometime this fall. But I know that there are other trails, a lot of them. I'd say there's a good 6 in the book that are pretty much completely level throughout, either on boardwalks or on, basically nicely graded woods roads that would be very easily done in wheelchair. So there are a number of sites that people could visit in that way.
Thank you. Now I know I'm starting to see questions popping into the chat and questions popping into the Q&A. If others among you have questions and would like to hear Tom's thoughts, please put your questions into that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or you can just type them in your chat and I'll see them and we'll get to as many as we have time for tonight. I know that some of you do, so go ahead and put those in. While we're gathering some questions, Tom, I wanted to ask you, you've spent a long time in the outdoors around this region and all around. What is the best outdoor advice and outdoor adventure advice you've ever gotten?
Oh boy. I don't know. I mean, there's nothing coming to mind about outdoor adventure advice. I mean,
or do you have any to pass on? Would be another.
Well, I mean, I just say that, if you're going to be out and about, that you just need to watch where you're putting your feet. I do go off trail quite a bit if I'm in areas where I know there's not a lot of people going off trail. But even then, I'm being really careful. I'm just trying to pick my way so that I'm not stepping on anything that's fragile as I go. The other thing that I've learned, and this wasn't taught to me, I've just picked it up, but if I am bushwhacking off trail, I am constantly stopping and looking behind me every few hundred meters to look at roadmap figures I can use for coming back. I don't use GPS or anything like that. So I'm just sort of ground truthing it as I go. I'll turn around and say, oh, there's that tree with the spiral scar. I have to look for that on the way back. And I find that that works very well for me. I just have a mental road map or trail map in my mind so that I feel very comfortable going off trail and I can find my way back because I'm constantly always turning around and looking for, landmarks that will lead me back.
When you go out, do you generally use a trail map, or are you a GPS guy, or do you just kind of go with it?
I'm not a GPS guy. I don't carry it. And if I'm to a new area where there's a hiking trail, I'll take maybe a trail map. But most of the time, I'm not carrying pretty much anything. I'm just going out. Like, for example, up here in Acadia National Park, I know all the trails, and I even know a lot of the abandoned trails. There's over 100 miles of abandoned trails. So I can just follow them. I don't really need a map. And like I said, if I am going to bushwhack off of a site, then I just am marking my way as I go, so I know how to find my way back.
So Daniel wants to know, do you just talk about flora and trees and plants in the book, or do you talk about the rocks as well, like those roadside geology guides?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely getting into the geology of the sites. So, around here, a lot of it is glacial history that I'll be going into. And I'm also talking a lot about dynamics, of co-evolved interactions between species. So I'm not just like identifying, individual plants or whatever else. I don't find that to be that interesting. I'm really getting into looking at the web of relationships that develop in a system. So, for example, in one of the sites, there's hemlocks that have been very much impacted by yellow-bellied sapsuckers. And I don't know, something's coming up on my screen here. I'll get rid of it in just a second. So, but see, what I talk about there is not only the sapsuckers use those sap wells and those hemlocks, but hummingbirds do as well. And matter of fact, there's something like 48 other species of birds, mammals, and insects that go to those sap wells to drink the sap. But the hummingbirds are very territorial. When they find a good sapsucker tree, they are going to defend it. And they'll drive a lot of the other consumers off, but they won't ever harass the sapsuckers. So here's a cool relationship where it's actually a mutually beneficial interaction. The hummingbirds are taking less energy than the amount they're saving by driving all the other consumers off. So I am looking at geology. I'm looking at these co-evolved interactions and relationships and things that people often don't know about, instead of just pointing out, well, here's this species of tree or here's this species of plant. I don't find that to be that informative.
Rachel has a question about bear activity. She says, has bear activity changed in the time that you've been studying the New England landscapes?
Not noticeably, except that one big change that's happening is with the decline of beech. You're just not seeing the evidence of bears in beech trees the way you did, let's say, 40 or 50 years ago, where you see these great foraging nests where they're breaking branches and cleaning off the nuts off the beech, or you'd see, the claw marks going up the trunk of the beech tree. That's getting less and less common to see as we sort of are losing healthy beech trees. So that is a change.
I've got a question from David, who loves you. He says, Ecology of Co-Evolved Species in New England Forests is one of my favorite videos ever. Thank you for the shout out, David. David says, wondering if you know of any concise resources for people who are terraforming their backyards with a mind to invasive and endangered local species. to help fight and support the proper ecology for specific habitats. He wants to know, with these resources, which things to plant and which things to burn. Do you have anything in mind?
Those resources I think you can get from various entities. So things like the Nature Conservancy, I know, has pamphlets on that sort of thing. I don't know about the terraforming aspect of it, but in terms of doing plantings, appropriate plantings, things like that, there are resources out there. I don't know of any one book on it that I can think of, but generally, if you are wanting to do something in a yard, it's best to work with plants that normally co-associate. So out in the woods, you have these associations that you see time and time again. And those plants have developed these co-evolved relationships, which make them way more resilient when they're together in that association. So I'd say work with native species that naturally co-associate, work with species from your locale. I know one of my graduate students has a plant nursery down in Connecticut where he only works with plants native to Connecticut that he's actually gotten in Connecticut, and he propagates there, and he only sells them to people in Connecticut. So he firmly believes work with your local plants that you have, because they have their own genotypes that are a bit different than other parts of the region. So work with your local native plants that normally co-associate. That'd be the way to go.
Everything is connected.
Yeah.
As we come to again and again. Great question in the chat from Mary. How different are the geologies of New Hampshire and Vermont? It would be great, actually, if you could talk about ecological differences. Oh, and she asks about that too. What types of ecological differences, if any, have you noticed between the two states?
They're quite different because New Hampshire is mostly underlain by granitic bedrocks that weather into coarser, more acidic, more nutrient deprived soils, whereas Vermont is underlain by metamorphic rocks that often have a lot of calcium in them that weather into finer, more nutrient enriched soils. And so you'll find, a lot more rich-sided plants over here in Vermont commonly than you will, let's say, in New Hampshire, because of that soil difference. But not only that, it has affected sort of the whole the whole socioeconomic systems of both states, because Vermont, since it had rich soils, the early economy was based on agriculture. And all these agricultural farms were small, sort of self-reliant farms. And so what developed was sort of a pretty egalitarian political system where no one entity had real political or economic clout. Whereas over in New Hampshire, the early economy is all based on timber, because the New Hampshire soils grew really good oak and pine, and spruce, which were sought after for timber. But they got very quickly controlled by timber barons, and right away, like the Wentworth family. So right away, you get this sort of, large scale, more corporate entity coming into play. And the two states have diverged very much because of that. So, it comes down to, Vermont having someone like Bernie Sanders as a senator, where New Hampshire would probably never have anyone that progressive as a senator. But I think it comes back again to their underlying bedrocks that cause the two sister states to sort of diverge a bit.
Thank you. Larry says, I lived for many years in the Pacific Northwest. Awesome. Where I fell in love with the forest floor, especially mosses and slime molds. What are the most interesting areas in New England for mosses?
Well, I think probably your best place to come would be up in coastal Maine, because of the cold ocean environment and the frequent fogs we get this band of spruce growing right along the coast, and those spruce forests get completely carpeted in moss. So there's a lot of areas right here on Mount Desert Island where if you go into a spruce forest of a certain age, 100% of the ground is completely covered by moss. It's like a complete carpet, and it is really elegant and amazing to see. And of course, this year also has been a great year for slime molds with all the water we're having. I'm seeing a lot of slime molds all over the place. And someone just passed me an article, which is really quite amazing, that was researchers working with slime molds in mazes to have the slime mold work through the maze to a food source. And actually, the slime molds learned this so that you could put them in another maze that was the same design, and they would quickly go the quickest route to the food source. So it's a good example of what's called biological cognizance. And here it is in slime molds. They're not just sort of, oblivious. Um, they're problem solvers, which is quite astounding.
Courtney asks, would you talk about tree diseases and pests and how climate change relates to this?
Well, I mean, we've got a lot, and we're going to get a lot more. We've had a lot of exotic, pathogens coming in, and I'm convinced we'll see more. Climate change adds to the stress of trees, so it makes it even harder for them to resist these things. However, I should say in the long run, I think things will be okay. When you have trees that are in a continental context, they usually have enough genetic diversity that not all individuals are going to die. And that means the ones that remain are the ones that have resistance, and that's your new breeding population. So I'm pretty convinced that, maybe 1,000 years from now, all of the trees that are currently suffering pathogens in the region, I think they're going to be fine. So, for example, 5,000 years ago, Eastern hemlock was distributed throughout its whole range that we see it in today. But we all of a sudden see hemlock disappear from 5,000 years ago in the Northeast United States till 4,000 years ago. It's gone for 1,000 years. We have no pollen of hemlock during that time frame. So either some sort of native species mutated to become a virulent pathogen, or maybe something came in from outside of the region. But coevolution moves species towards more energy efficient and more beneficial relationships. And so I am confident in the long run, our trees will be fine. But what it means is that over a period of centuries, we're going to have to be like Noah, sort of stewarding our native species through these various problems of, climate change and aggressive invasive species, pathogens, until the system can work it out. Because nature will work it out. It'll solve the problems we're currently seeing. It just takes time, but we've got to be, I guess, pretty focused on generation after generation, helping to maintain our natives while this is all being worked out.
Can we follow up on that? How can we help with that stewardship?
Well, I think let's say if we're talking about invasive plants. So I often say we ought to think of it as like triage. We're not getting rid of invasive plants. They're here to stay. So we've got to really be very strategic in where we're putting our efforts. So we first put our efforts into areas that are unique ecosystems and have rare and endangered species. We want to make sure that invasives don't get in there, because that's part of our Noah's effort to keep our natives around while this is being worked out. Secondly, we want to go into areas where the invasives are just coming in, where they're easily weeded and can be, sort of taken care of that way. And then thirdly, as time allows, we can go into other areas, but there are going to be a lot of places we're just not going to get to. And that's going to be okay, because those will be the places where coevolution starts to work, and having these species adjust their ecologies to become more functional members in the community through time. So for an example, 3 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama formed, which joined North America to South America, which had been separated for tens of millions of years. A lot of South American species migrated in North America. A lot of North American species migrated into South America, creating probably very dramatic invasive problems. But here we are now 3 million years later, and all of those species have become functional members in their new ecosystem. So nature is quite resilient and will work these things out, but it takes time.
Thank you. We've got good questions coming in. We do have a few more minutes, so if you've got a burning question for Tom, do throw it into the chat or into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And like I say, we'll get to as many as we can. before the end of the hour. I've got one from Tom here in the chat. He's asking about American chestnuts. Tom says, are we going to see American chestnuts or mostly genetically American chestnuts back in New England anytime soon?
I'd say in the last probably decade, I've come across 5 stands of American chestnut that are reproducing. So the canopy trees get up to about 14 inches in diameter. They eventually succumb to the blight, but they're resisting it for enough time that they're probably reproductively active for maybe a good 40 or 50 years. And since American chestnut has to cross-pollinate to make viable nuts, that means the offspring of those trees should have a little bit greater level of resistance. So maybe those trees will make it to 20 inches. Maybe their offspring will make it to 30. And after a number of generations, I think we'll see resistant chestnuts that are living to good old age and starting to expand out back through their range. But again, like I said, this takes time, but I expect we will see them come back. One thing that concerns me, I think we need to learn to be more patient when we're dealing with these issues, because, we rushed right into the idea that, oh golly, we better do something quick. So let's bring in Oriental chestnuts and cross them with American chestnuts to get resistant trees. Well, we may get resistant trees, but we don't know what that eventual hybrid will look like. I mean, American chestnut were mammoth trees. We have pre-blight photographs of chestnuts up to 13 feet in diameter, which is just a huge tree for a eastern broadleaved hardwood. And yet Oriental chestnuts don't have that stature. So I wish we had just worked with our native strains more patiently to get them to come back. But we're already down that road, and there's a lot of hybrids already out there.
Got a comment and a question from Judith. She says, thank you for your book, Reading the Forested Landscape, which has permanently enhanced all my walks in the woods for a long time now. I know that's a favorite of a lot of folks at the Norwich Bookstore. So much so that I think in anticipation of this talk, we had some people in buying up our copies. So thank you for that. Judith wants to know, what do you think the eventual effects of the miles of Japanese knotwood on our riverbanks will be?
Boy, it's a bad one. I mean, that's probably one of our real aggressive invasives. Matter of fact, I think I've heard that it's invasive in all continents now and has the greatest biomass of any root perennial on the planet. So it's a problem because once it comes in, it chokes out everything. I have dealt with it here on our property up in Maine. We had about 1/3 of an acre. It took me 7 years, but I was able to eradicate it pretty easily without herbicides or anything. What I did was the first year we were here, I sickled it down, and the ground was even enough that I could then run a lawnmower over it every couple of weeks to cut the shoots. And then after that first year, I would just go out once a week and just clip every young shoot growing up. And the clone just sort of shrank and eventually disappeared. It didn't take me a lot of time because every week I'd go out for maybe just a few minutes, but it took a lot of vigilance, and it took having to be steady and keep doing it, and I got rid of it. Eventually something is going to come along that's going to find that knotweed is a great energy resource, and it's going to start eating it. It's going to be one of our native species. It's going to change its behaviors. And once that happens, we're going to start to see now a biological control starting to come in and curtail knotweed. It hasn't happened yet, but I'm confident it will happen at some point down the line.
I've got a question in the chat about how is the American elm doing?
The American elm is still suffering from, Dutch elm disease. We do have specimens that seem to have some resistance, sort of like the American chestnut, and they can, produce offspring and stuff, which through time you'd expect to get more resistant. There are some strains of Liberty elms and other strains that are native trees that have resistance that are being planted out there to increase the number of resistant trees in regions. So I think eventually we'll see them coming back, but again, will take time.
Do you have a a success story that you can think of some of these species adapting within our lifetime? Is there an example of something changing its behavior in the recent past that you've seen?
I don't think I can. I don't doubt that that has probably happened in some areas, that I'm not aware of. I can't think of one right here. I mean, I can think of a lot of examples of our current species that used to be in much more nasty situations that aren't anymore. So for example, like the oak ball gall, the ball gall grows in the underside of oak leaves. It's hollow. And studies have shown that the amount of embedded energy in the gall itself is less than the amount of photosynthesis that gall does through the growing season. So I'm sure that when that started, that was probably a pretty nasty parasite of oak leaves. It might have even destroyed the leaves. But now any leaf that gets the gall actually gets an energy boost from it. So there you've gone from a pretty nasty parasitic relationship to one that's now mutually beneficial. And we have lots of examples like that of, in our current system. I can't think of one that I've seen that has originated from a pathogen and evolved to that sort of state in, my span here of studying these ecosystems. But I don't doubt that somewhere that may have happened.
Emma in the Q&A wants to know if you are concerned about jumping worms.
Yes, I am, because again, they're one of these, invasives, and a lot of these invasive earthworms, it's not that they just can, remove, other native species or remove leaf litter, but, some of them remove the mycorrhizal fungal network, and that has huge implications for our forests. So yes, it's a serious concern.
I'm just concerned just by the name of the.
Well, they can be pretty unsettling because they move a lot, and if you've ever seen them, they'll catch your eye. That's for sure.
Can I ask you really quickly about another invasive species that's been in the news a lot, the spotted lanternfly? Have you encountered them during your research for the book, or?
I have not. I have not encountered them yet. One of the other ones that I just recently encountered up here is brown-tailed moth, which is one that has been in coastal Maine for a while, but it just got up onto Mount Desert Island just recently. And I'm starting to see the impacts of that up here at this point in time.
The advice I've heard is if you see them, kill them. Do you agree with that, or?
Well, I would. I mean, if I had them in my property, yes, I would do that because at least for like the brown-tailed moth, not only is it problematic for like our oak trees and our fruit trees and stuff, but it's the hairs of the caterpillar are incredibly irritating. So you can just have them blown onto you by a breeze. They last for up to 3 years, and they'll give people a rash like poison ivy. And if you breathe them in, it can be very serious in terms of respiratory issues. So yeah, if I had them around my yard, I would, because they're a real health threat.
We've got time for just a couple more questions. So if you have them, do drop them into the Q&A as we wrap up the hour. Bud in the Q&A wants to know, is it a mistake to cut down all the ash trees?
Here's again where I think we need to be more patient. So there's going to be ash trees out there that are going to have some sort of resistance. And unlike a red oak or red maple that are vigorous stump sprouters, if you cut them, they'll sprout right back. Ash is not that vigorous a stump sprouter. So I worry that if in our overzealousness, I start thinking we're just going to lose all the ash, cut them down, I don't think that's a good idea. I think, we need to be a little bit more patient. And if trees are definitely dying, then you cut them. But I wouldn't cut them right off the bat, because you may be cutting down a tree that has resistance and you won't even know it. And if it doesn't stump sprout, you've killed that resistant tree.
Proceed with caution.
Yeah.
Do you have any additional book recommendations for people who want to learn more about specific parts of the region or about native plants, for instance. Do you have any recommendations for people who want to do further reading on New England ecology?
Well, I mean, a couple books I would recommend. They're not just for New England, but they are for the Northeast. So would be Robin Kimmerer's book. She has one, Gathering Moss, Braiding Sweetgrass. She is a botanist and knows the plants of the region well, but she's also an indigenous person with an indigenous heritage, and she weaves, what's wonderful about it, science and indigenous knowledge together in very, very practical and forceful ways. So I'd say that can teach you a good deal about native plants, but also opening up a larger worldview that I think is very helpful to have. So I would say those would be high recommendations on my list.
Great. And we have one more question from Tom, who is asking about fens. Are there any fens featured in the book, and could you comment on why they are special plants?
Yeah, there are a couple of fens that are in the book. I mean, tangentially, because the chapter wasn't focused on them. I'm just coming across them as I'm moving along some of these trails. So like up at Great Wasp, we crossed 2 small fens in that chapter, and there's some others. So fens are a wetland that's sort of in between marshes and bogs. They're sort of intermediate in their acidity level and their amount of nutrients. And we get enriched fens. Those are really special wetlands, because that's where we start getting all of our wetland orchids. So we can get really great diversity of wetland orchids in our enriched fens. So, and I should mention that Vermont is blessed with a lot of enriched fens. So something that we don't see over in New Hampshire, let's say, across the river.
Great, thank you. Well, we are coming to the end of our hour together, and I personally feel like it just zipped right by. But Tom, thank you for spending it with us. Are there any thoughts that you want to leave us with about your new book, New England's Roadside Ecology?
I don't think so. I think the book speaks for itself. So, if people are interested, they can check it out. But no, but thank you, Sam, for having me on. I appreciate it. And thanks for everyone for being here and listening to us. Yeah,
thank you. Thank you. And you can pick up New England's Roadside Ecology at the Norwich Bookstore if you are here in the Upper Valley. We've got it on the shelves now. You can pick it up online, norwichbookstore.com. Link is in the chat. And wherever you are, I hope that you purchase this book from a local independent bookstore and get out and go exploring. This is a great time for it. And from wherever you're joining us tonight, we are so grateful to all of you for tuning in. Thank you to Tom Wessels. Thank you to Timber Press, our great small press partners who put together New England's Roadside Ecology. Again, this is the new book by Tom Wessels. I love the cover. I love what's inside it. I think you will too. So I do hope you'll pick it up. If you want to know about further events that we've got going on, you can visit our website, norwichbookstore.com. You can sign up for our email newsletter, where we're always posting about new author events we've got coming up. And you can also follow us on social media. We're at Norwich Bookstore on most of the major platforms. And you can check us out there. We've always got something new going on in the store or online. So we hope that we'll see you back here. Tom Wessels, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And thank you for all the good work you do.
My pleasure.
Thank you to everyone out there. Be safe, do good work, and read good books. We'll see you next time.